It's great to welcome to the program today Jonathan Haber, who's the author of the new book Critical Thinking from MIT Press, also the guy behind logiccheck.net, a website that checks not just the facts, but also the reasoning behind the news of the day. It's so great to have you on, Jonathan.
Great to be on, David.
So what
Thanks.
what is the sort of origin of critical thinking as a discipline? Does it come from some of those philosophers that many of us were introduced to in freshman year of college? Is it older than that?
Well, it definitely draws on those ancient disciplines, certainly philosophy, particularly Western philosophy, the work of Aristotle, but also more modern disciplines such as science, particularly some of the early science that was a discourse between philosophers and sort of proto-scientists, psychology more recently, and then most recently cognitive science. So actually, critical thinking itself, the concept that there's a form of thinking unique enough to be all called critical, distinct from intelligence and wisdom, is actually a 20th century concept.
The some of the so we've seen what a media literacy class can look like, teaching one to critically analyze media messages, critical thinking, epistemology. There's a lot of material on the internet. Is the reason that a lot of this material is necessary that these are not concepts that we intuitively learn, in the sense that at some point, a baby realizes that the circle is not going to fit into the rectangular peg, or the triangular peg or whatever, and it's an intuitive lesson? Are the critical thinking skills that you espouse and talk about in the book, are they not something humans intuitively pick up?
Well, they're definitely not. Our intuitions actually need to be disciplined, which is why you need to structure your thinking in order to reason. I think science is a good example where people have not historically always thought scientifically. That was something that was constructed, and over centuries, really, the discipline of thinking scientifically sort of developed into a norm. I think critical thinking is much more broad than that. It's something that you could apply not just to science, but to every subject. But it's not something that comes intuitively, nor is it taught. I mean, it used to be, going back to Roman times, logic, rhetoric, those were the cornerstones of the educational curriculum right through modernity. But in modern times, we, of course, have many more things to learn: modern science, history, cultures, language, which is great. But I think that meant that logic, rhetoric, some of the critical thinking kind of core foundational skills have been crowded out in favor of new knowledge. And I think that's one of the reasons we both lack the intuition, but we're not taught this in schools.
Are we currently sort of at a bad moment when it comes to critical thinking skills in the population at large? I mean, I know we've been tracking anti-intellectual movements certainly for a couple hundred years with a pretty significant degree of specificity, but is there some sort of like peak that we are now experiencing, or dearth maybe is the right word?
I think there's not been some golden age where everybody thought critically, and we've sort of fallen off since then. I mean, this has always been a set of skills that some people take on, some people don't. Some people may be more naturally inclined towards thinking reasonably than others. Or you have, what's very typical is people will think critically about subjects like their jobs, right? They'll make decisions about, you're a carpenter, how to cut a piece of wood. You're a computer programmer. You can think very logically when you're writing code, but we will not apply it to things like political decisions, whom to vote for, or even sort of interpersonal decisions. So I think probably what makes this period more nerve-wracking is that there are all kinds of ways to support thinking poorly. If critical thinking is kind of thinking well, there are less productive ways of thinking. You can believe whatever you already believe, confirmation bias. You could believe whatever you're told, right? Just believe authority figures. And I think now that we have a new media landscape, particularly with social media, that allows us to isolate ourselves into bubbles where we don't really even have to listen to anybody we disagree with. I think a lot of the sort of toxic politics and miscommunication we have is a result of, not so much that people aren't internalizing the rules of critical thinking. I think just there's more sources of bad premises, I guess, around.
Is the What is the mechanism that is most effective at disarming one's critical thinking faculties? I mean, you sort of alluded in a way personal life things and political things as opposed to how a woodworker may best cut a piece of wood. Is it sort of having a personal stake which blinds us maybe to applying the same type of critical thinking we otherwise would?
Well, I think that there's, critical thinking skills. You had your YouTube channel where you cover many of the logical skills that are vital to critical thinking. That's what's covered in a lot of critical thinking courses you might take in college, and there's a lot of material on the internet on logic and fallacies and those sorts of things. So that's the sort of knowledge you need, but then you need the skills to use that knowledge. In other words, if we're talking about logic for this example, you need to put those skills to use, put logical principles to use a lot in lots of situations in your work, in your school, in your life. And you need to sort of favor thinking reasonably, thinking logically over other forms of reasoning, such as just believing what you've already believed. But then there's a whole group of dispositions. You have to want to apply logic to things that might make you uncomfortable, like examining your own beliefs, for example. And I think that without all three pieces, without the knowledge, the skills, and the dispositions, you can't really be think of yourself as a critical thinker. So I'd say situations where people, are very skilled thinkers in certain parts of their life, but turn off reason when it comes to other factors, that's a form of sort of not thinking critically in terms of not exercising proper critical thinking dispositions.
Yeah, so you can't teach someone to want to examine their own beliefs, right? I mean, so you could maybe encourage someone, but it's not a teachable skill in the same way that identifying fallacies would be.
I think it's not teachable, except that you can learn about the sort of flaws in the human makeup that are non-cognitive, right? Some of them are, we could be led by emotions or instincts, right? Those can overwhelm reason. And also, there's cognitive biases. There's been a whole cottage industry of people writing about confirmation bias and anchoring bias and all these various sort of, flaws in our reasoning. So I think you can learn about the human mind's makeup and understand that we are all susceptible to flawed thinking, and therefore we shouldn't assume we're always right. But I think in terms of dispositions, that would fall in the category of kind of morals education, that these are intellectual virtues, right? Open-mindedness, faith in reason, intellectual humility. And I think you can learn those the same way you learn other moral principles by example. For example, if your household, if these sort of intellectual virtues are practiced, then you'll tend to likely internalize them. If you live in a household with dogmatic politics, for example, or a place where fundamental beliefs are never questioned, then you will learn that, right? You'll learn not to question beliefs. So I think that they can be learned. It's sort of like behaviors, any sort of ethical behavior, you learn them over time.
When it comes to make this really concrete, given the subject matter of this program, when it comes to political messages and material that we get through corporate media and mass media, what would you say are the one or two sort of lowest hanging fruit in terms of the principles that, if more frequently applied, would lead to far more informed people? So like one that I might look at would be just understanding correlation versus causation, right?
Mm-hmm.
With coronavirus, people who get really sick tend to have lower vitamin D levels. Is that a causation or is that a correlation explained by something else? The economy did well after something happened with taxes. Did it do well because of that, or are they both impact, right? So that would be one that I would maybe consider, but I'm curious what you would think about as the most important, lowest hanging fruit that would most help consumers of political news.
Well, I think, correlation versus causation, much like the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning and many of the topics that kind of go into being a critical thinker, those are all vital. And I think the good news is one can learn what they are and how to use them relatively quickly. I mean, I think your videos were 3 to 5 minutes on each of these topics. I did a program called Critical Voter that sort of taught much of the same material. I was surprised how easy it is to learn those things. So I think certainly, the three things I would recommend is one, learn those things because it doesn't take that much time. But I think, if you want the low hanging fruit, the things to do would be one, to practice them, to use them as much as possible. Critical thinking is really a skill. It's kind of like playing the piano or being good at a sport, right? The more you do it, the better you get. There's one researcher who thinks critical thinking is like, a sport or an instrument. It takes 10,000 hours to get really good at it. So I'd say because the knowledge and the techniques are relatively easy to pick up, it's just a question of how much you dedicate to practicing them. And then I guess the other piece I'd say the lowest hanging fruit, even though it might be the most difficult, is charitability, being charitable to opinions, especially those you don't agree with. I think show you did last week, you referred to steel manning an argument, which as opposed to straw manning an argument. And that's really a reflection of the principle of charity, right? You should try to address the strongest version of an opponent's argument rather than attacking one flaw in it or coming up with a weak version or a parody. And that's relatively easy to do when it's your own arguments you're looking to sort of strengthen. I think the hardest part is to treat opposing arguments, treating arguments from people who you fundamentally disagree with in a charitable fashion. But I think a lot of intellectual virtues kind of derive from that spirit of charity.
In the limited time we have, is there one specific example that you've seen be one of the most difficult beliefs or areas of subject matter for people to really think critically about?
Well, the two big ones are obviously politics and religion, right? Because these both are fundamentally about our identity. And I think certainly as religion fades as a foundation of our identity, our sort of political identities take on many qualities that were once of you'd see in religious-based conflicts, kind of the level of heatedness. So I would say, the understanding that any argument based on somebody's identity is going to be treated very sensitively, right? Because nobody ever changed their mind about a belief fundamental to their identity because they lost an argument, right? Nobody changed their mind because they lost an argument on Twitter, for example, but even sort of lost, a more civilized argument, right? That might crack the ice. That might sort of get you thinking, oh, maybe there's some things I don't know, or maybe some of the things I believe I should question. But changing your mind, changing beliefs about something that's very, very personal to you is something that leaves you very vulnerable. So I think if we want to change the minds of others, which obviously, your program and other media programs like it are looking to do, you should sort of do what you can to empathize with those you disagree with, try to get into their heads, try to understand what they're thinking. And an exercise I often challenge people on is, think about what argument would get you to change your mind about something that you strongly believe in. And that'll get you to sort of understand the difficulty of such a situation. And once you can appreciate it, then I think you might be in a better position to address opponents or address people who you disagree with in a more empathetic and I think ultimately potentially more successful way.
The book is Critical Thinking. We've been speaking with the author Jonathan Haber, whose work you can also find at logiccheck.net. Jonathan, really appreciate your time, and it's been a pleasure having you.
Oh, thank you. And thanks for all your work as well.